Thank you. We have a slide changer here. I would like to tell you a number of jokes, but frankly, the U.S. is pretty funny these days, and so I really don't have to tell you any jokes. You can just laugh anytime you want. I think you're going to have two Americans in a row up here, and you'll have to guess whether they are facts or alternative facts. I didn't know that we were that suspicious up until this year, but apparently we are celebrating fiction. This must be the year of fiction in the United States, and so that's what we're up to. We are actually quite concerned that people wouldn't come to our annual conference this year because, you know, we're keeping people out of our country. And so we decided to come to Toronto. And so we invite you all to come to Toronto with our annual conference. And I think we have queued up a little video from the City of Toronto for our annual conference in 2017. Haven't been to an IEDC conference in the past. We hope that you will join us. I refer to it as a conference on steroids because we'll have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 people, multiple sessions, tours throughout the city and the region, it's you know, it's kind of an overdose of economic development for about 3.5 days, and if you decide to come to the training course before that, you can make it 5.5 days. If you decide to get a certification from us, you can even make it longer. So what I'm going to try to do in less than 15 minutes is talk a little bit about IEDC's annual survey that we do. We undertake a survey, and we have since about 2008, maybe 2007, about what are the trends in economic development. We call it the State of the Industry Report. And it kind of shares with the field, you know, what are people focused on, what's going on with their budgets. Now, IEDC has about 180 to 200 Canadian members. So Canadians are also responding to this survey. So this is an amalgamation of numbers based on all of our economic development members. We have about 5,000 members, a couple hundred in Canada, a couple dozen in Mexico, and then we have them around the rest of the world. Very small in the rest of the world. So this is the results of that survey. We do it at the end of each year. So I talked already about where our respondents are from. And what we do, and by the way, Chris King and I were on a session yesterday, and he says that you guys may use the word EDO a little different than we do. When I'm referring to EDOs, I'm talking about organizations, not officials or not individuals. So if I'm talking about an EDO priority, the person is answering the question in regards to what their organization is looking at. In comparison to 2015, how has your budget changed? And this was a question, and we started this survey at about the time of the major U.S. recession in 2008, and budgets were declining very rapidly. In fact, in a couple places, economic development organizations completely collapsed. Their communities would no longer fund them. I always have thought that economic development should be funded better in a downturn, that we probably should be considered somewhat counter-cyclical. You spend more marketing money, frankly, when things are bad. You shouldn't have to spend as much when things are good. That never happens because, frankly, local budgets are such that, you know, how do you justify throwing more money at your economic development organization at the same time you're laying off police and fire? And those are the tough decisions that local governments oftentimes have to spend. So what we discovered is we were staying the same or growing in most places. 17% of our members were experiencing some budget cuts. Since the recessions, how did it appear from the previous year? More funding. A number of people were seeing a little less funding. In 2016, compared to your previous year, we found that organizations were hiring more staff. In many cases, starting in 2008, 2009, and 2010, many EDOs, and particularly in the States, not necessarily in Canada, were bleeding staff pretty hard. They were cutting out international trips. They weren't doing as many FDI calls. Frankly, there wasn't as much deal flow, so they weren't meeting with many site selectors. They weren't going to as many conferences. They were cutting those things out first, but then staff and staff benefits. So what we've seen is the organizations are hiring more staff, they're increasing staff pay and benefits, and they're increasing program spending. And frankly, one of the reasons they're paying more for staff is because if you don't in these better times, you're going to lose those staff to either other EDOs, or what I have seen in this profession is you lose them to real estate developers, you lose them to banks. There are alternative jobs for economic developers other than the field of economic development. What areas have people spent and by the money on? And by the way, you will put this, you'll have this presentation to share with people, so you don't have to take pictures of it. But FDI has been the big winner in increased spending. What we've discovered is that North America is a safe place for many international companies to invest and grow. And at least in the lower 48, Alaska and Hawaii, many companies are now starting to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. And Canada because it has gotten increasingly costly to be in China. It has also become increasingly difficult to be in China. Our companies are having their intellectual property stolen, supply chain becomes contaminated, and it has become more expensive to move product from places like China back to North America. One of the big concerns, at least in the U.S., is our infrastructure spending has not kept up, and that is one of the problems. In 2009 and 2010, when there wasn't a lot of attraction deal flow, people spent a lot more effort and money around business retention. Keeping what they had became the byword versus trying to attract something that, trying to find a company willing to expand or relocate was very difficult at the time. Where are people spending their efforts? What types of businesses are they trying to focus on? Now, I just heard the economist, as you did, many of these businesses didn't come up because you guys are so heavily focused on oil and gas, agriculture. But the big winners in the overall survey are advanced manufacturing, healthcare. Energy comes in third in our survey. Information technology and logistics kind of round up those areas where people are trying to grow their economy. Have our organizations entered into more partnerships? One of the things we discovered because of the recession, people couldn't do everything that they were doing before, And so they solve some of those problems with partnering with other organizations. They would partner with a regional organization, they would partner with a chamber of commerce, they would partner with another community in order so there was a lack of duplication. We actually helped the Buffalo, New York region a number of years ago identify what were their economic development organizations do. The first thing we discovered is that in the region there were about 40 organizations declaring they did economic development. And then we asked them specifically what they did. Almost everybody said they were doing attraction. Nobody was doing it other than a couple organizations very well. Everybody said they were doing international trade finance. They're sitting on the Canadian border. There were only 2 or 3 that were doing it well. So when you get into those scenarios, it's hard to justify staff to do all of those things among 40 organizations. It's probably best to partner. To what degree are equity and economic opportunity a concern for you? So as the U.S. economy, and I heard somebody talk about equity yesterday in this conference, there have been a lot of people that haven't recovered. You know, people with educations have recovered pretty well. People that have technology degrees, 2-year associate degrees in computers and engineering technologies have done pretty well. But we've left a lot of people behind. Now the question is, what can we do as economic developers to try to either find training for those folks where there's an equity or inequality at work or find jobs for them? And we've been asking that question for a couple years now. What is the economic developer's role? We're finding that many of our city leaders are expecting economic developers to help carry that role. It used to be a role that you might have looked to your job training agencies, you might have looked to social welfare organizations. We're now looking to economic developers to help play that role. You're the guy from the League of Cities. Clarence spoke at our annual conference this past year, and actually that's the president or executive director of the League of Cities. They're focused on this issue as well, and this has become particularly important. This year, how have you altered your organization's strategy? We discover that organizations tend to do updated strategic plans about every 3 years. How have those things changed? We're focused a lot more on entrepreneurship among many of the economic development organizations, collaborating more on a regional basis, engaged more in economic partnerships. We're investing a lot more in workforce. The issue that is going on, I will speak for the states again, I'm sure it's going on in Ontario, where I've spent a fair amount of time this year in preparation for our annual conference. Companies are complaining to the economic development community that they're having a hard time finding trained workers. So all of a sudden, economic developers who, I swear to you, 10 years ago couldn't spell the word workforce, are now into it up to their eyeballs, whether they like it or not. And the fastest growing title in many economic development organizations is a vice president or deputy director in charge of talent attraction, talent retention, talent something. They use talent versus workforce. They think the word's sexy or something. But that has become a big byword in the economic development space. In looking compared to 2009, how are things changed? In 2009, our members were focused on business retention. Remember, you were experiencing a dip here, according to your economist. We were experiencing a huge dip in the States. And if you were going to talk to a business, you might as well talk to one that's already invested in your community and try to make sure they're hanging on for all it's worth in your community. Organizations were looking at strategic partnerships. Only 22% were focused on workforce. There were so many people out of work that they were all scrambling for jobs, and companies kind of had the pick of the litter. That's not the case now. The number one for most organizations is workforce. Do people plan to revamp their economic development strategic plan this year? What we're discovering through this survey is about every other year or every 3 years, most organizations are updating their strategic plans. Are they focused on staff diversity? you know, this is an issue in Canada. It's certainly an issue in the United States. Are we thinking about what our staff looks like? And in the same way, can the staff that we have relationships with new entrepreneurs? There are places in the U.S. that have almost an entire Anglo staff in a community that is mostly minority. That sometimes doesn't work when you're trying to talk to those business leaders who don't have the same life experiences. So many people are trying to figure out, how do we find trained African Americans, trained Latinos? I mean, if you're doing business in an EDO in San Antonio, Texas, if you don't have bilingual staff, you're in real trouble, because much of your investment is coming from Mexico, and some of the entrepreneurs who are coming to town or who own those businesses, they may still live in Mexico, Monterrey, Mexico, for instance. You need to figure out how you're going to communicate with them. Second, are people measuring the performance of their EDOs? Over the last 3 to 5 years, IEDC has taken up the banner, what are the measurements that we should be looking at in terms of successful economic development efforts? What's the return on investment of the public dollars that are coming to you? What is the return on investment on any private sector dollars that you're dealing with? If you're an IEDC member, you can go online and pull down for free our metrics report that we have, and I'd be happy to give Leanne a copy. Maybe she could have somebody do a story about it on your in your newsletter or something. But it has become a question that is asked both on the public side and on the private side. What defines success? I just had that conversation yesterday with a magazine based out of, or at least the reporter was based out of New Orleans. It's called CEO Magazine, and we were talking about return on investment. And they were specifically asking about the state economic development agencies and the trend in the U.S. In some cases to go to public-private partnerships, and they were asking, were those better? And I said, well, you know, it kind of depends on the state, what's going on in the economy there, and frankly, we're in this place of debate in the economic development space. Is our job to grow capital investment and increase tax base, or is our job to grow jobs, no matter what wage level? I could tell you 10 to 12 years ago that most economic developers in most cities would have been in agreement that we should be looking to add higher wage jobs with benefits, with higher skill requirements, and that would be what deals that they would tell their economic developers to go chase. This whole question of equity and people that are not keeping up is now starting to put a new criteria on the table, and that may be just gross jobs and maybe in some cases less than average wage jobs in that growth connection. IEDC has an accredited economic development organization program. We asked if people were thinking about applying for that. Leadership skills. One of the things we've been testing on leadership skills in 2 areas. One, are we training leaders of the future? There are a bunch of people my age that are going to be popping out of this profession, and frankly, we're losing them every day. But over the next 5 or 6 years, if I took you across North America, I could say, you know, we're going to lose 25% or more of the CEOs of economic development organizations. And do we have people with the requisite skills that we are going to be able to grow into those positions? And so we've been asking our members, are you thinking about skill development? The second thing that we've been asking about, and we hear this complaint, and I know you guys have been addressing this, is are our public officials also up to speed in terms of understanding what economic development is, what role they play in the space of economic development, and do they understand what our jobs are? And so we've also been asking questions around that as well. And continuing with that leadership question and the numbers of people that we expect will be leaving the field, we ask a question about succession planning. That is important both at public agencies as well as in our public-private partnership organizations that we have as well. 60% don't have a succession plan in place for the senior leaders that may be moving on. We ask a question whether people are looking to their staff as terms of whether they're going to go on to become certified or not. The next question, I have already kind of told you about that ahead of time, is what are we doing about training local elected officials? In IEDC's case, we partner with the National League of Cities. The National League of Cities and IEDC just put out a new report. It was revealed within the last 10 days at your legislative conference, and it's the second time we've partnered with the National League of Cities on a document to be shared with local elected officials on some of the issues that they have to deal with as elected officials. We had National Public Radio come to one of our leadership conferences in the heart of the recession. I don't know if any of you have heard Ira Glass, This American Life. This is public radio with a twist. And they came and they talked to us about what was going on in the economy. And the funny thing of it was that we were in the heart of the recession. And Ira Glass noted that we were the most optimistic bunch he had ever run into. Because even though we were still losing jobs throughout the country, people were saying, oh, our economy is doing well. So we continue to be an optimistic lot. How would you rate your organization? Most of our folks, 64%, said they are doing better and their local economies were doing better than they were in the previous year. So that concludes, in as close to 15 minutes as I could get, Leanne, what we find, and this is a report we update every year and we present at our leadership conference, and I'm happy to share it with you. I must tell you, the woman that introduced me today at this session is one of my heroes, and Sarah, I was so pleased that you recognized her last night, and whatever Leanne asks, I normally say yes, so congratulations for having her, and thank you for inviting me.